Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's AMA session, Doing Business in Indonesia, with regard to the legal compliances, intellectual property rights, and market entry. I'm Swarn Dhiman, and on behalf of AECCI, I'll be your host for this exciting discussion. We are delighted to bring this special Ask Me Anything session for the members of the Indian trade community. Today's session will focus on 6 key questions that stay at the top of the businesses exploring opportunities in Indonesia. We are honored to have with us Mr. Jonathan Jeong, a legal consultant and our esteemed collaborator from Bagus Enrico and Partners Indonesia. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me, Swan. It's my pleasure to come and have a little chat with yourself on behalf of the firm and as well on behalf of Tirta Mas Mandiri Indonesia, which is our subsidiary, of which
Okay.
I'm a director there as well. So it's my pleasure. My
Okay,
pleasure.
thank you so much. Thank you. And before we start, let us know a little more about the AMA session, AECCI, Bagus Enrico, and the speaker, Mr. Jonathan. So I'll just give the brief of to you all. This AMA session, this is being organized under the virtual B2B forum by Asian Exporters Chamber of Commerce and Industry. As you all know, we are a prominent chamber of commerce based in Mumbai, India, and is proudly recognized by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. We are working with the primary objective of promoting the international trade. As a trade body, we keep coming up with various initiatives and activities for the promotion of the international trade. Today's AMA session is part of a recent initiative of signing up the cooperation agreement with the trade and law experts across 40 countries and bringing their expertise to you all. So, to encourage international trade partnerships and knowledge sharing. Today's session is held in collaboration with one of our esteemed international collaborations, Bagus Enrico and Partners, that is a leading corporate and commercial law firm in Indonesia, having received constant domestic and international recognition for excellent practices in corporate mergers and acquisitions, technology, media, and telecommunications, and real estate. Firm is continuously expanding reach in other fast-growing sectors. And our expert speaker, Mr. Jonathan Jeong, is a certified mediator in both the UK and the Singapore, specializing in alternative dispute resolution. He is an associate of the Chartered Institution of Arbitrators and a member of the Honorable Society of Lincoln Inn, with a particular focus on ADR and its development across the APAC region. Mr. Jonathan has extensive experience in mediating disputes within the construction industry. And before we dive into our discussion, a quick note on the format of the session. Here, I'll pose a set of planned questions to Mr. Jonathan and we'll have the expert insight. So without taking more time, let us dive in and welcome Mr. Jonathan. Thank you, sir, for sparing the time. And once again, welcome on behalf of AECCI and all the Indian trade community.
Thank you very much, Swan. And on behalf of the firm as well as our subsidiary, as I said again, it's my absolute pleasure to share specific insights in relation to the market entry into Indonesia.
Yes, sir. Right, right. So, let me begin with my first question. And
Sure, absolutely, please.
yeah, same as you said, we will be starting with the big picture that is the market entry strategies. That is very important to know, in fact. So, my question would be, what are the most preferred market entry strategies for foreign businesses in Indonesia? Um,
Sure.
yeah, sir.
So maybe what I can start off is, well, first and foremost, market entry strategies is the first vocal point to ensure that the investment from any company, specifically from India or anywhere around the world, when they come into Indonesia, they are sure of what exactly they are getting themselves into. So I won't go into the most aspects of what exactly would be the things that you're supposed to look out for, of which I'm sure the specific companies targeting to the country would know. But
Mhm.
what we'll be focusing on now for that question, thank you, Swan, is about the market entry strategy for foreign businesses specifically. So normally in Indonesia, the first point would essentially be what I would consider, well, a joint venture. So
Okay.
that joint venture is frequently used, especially where foreign ownership restrictions apply. So in Indonesia, there's specific restrictions in relation to what exactly is the percentage of which a foreign company can hold, depending on the specific industry. That's
Okay.
for one. So
Okay.
by this JV, actually, it allows for foreign businesses to partner with a local company meaning in Indonesia. And by partnering with a local company, essentially, it offers access to local networks,
Okay.
especially land rights, especially in the sectors like agriculture and property, and
Okay.
essentially about the regulatory know-how of how to navigate within the aspects of Indonesia. So that's the first aspect that essentially a company can look into penetrating the Indonesian market. And the
Okay.
second one is something called a representative office, everyone. So a
Okay.
representative office is essentially is exactly as what it is called. It is a representative from the headquarters, for example, from India.
Right.
So if the headquarters is based in India and they would like to, for example, penetrate the Indonesian market, instead of going through a JV, for example, a representative office essentially is suitable for companies. Correct, yes. So as I've said about joint ventures, essentially what it does that it allows for uh, companies from, we'll talk specifically about India. So for Indian companies to essentially work in collaboration with a local Indonesian company. So essentially that is what a JV does. So
Right.
it allows local insights, etc., etc. But at the same time, it allows to be aspect of ensuring that the so-called negative aspects. Now, what do I mean by negative aspects? There is specific amount of percentages that a foreign company is allowed to hold, depending on the actual area of business. So
Right.
that is something I will go into more detail later. So now what can move on apart from a joint venture, as I'm sure many of our friends listening to this would know, is it applies as well in Indonesia. So now
Okay.
moving to the next specific point that looks deeper into Indonesia as one of the largest economies in Southeast Asia is something called a representative office. Now, a representative office is essentially it is suitable for companies looking to study the market
Okay.
or essentially build networks without engaging in commercial activities. Now,
Okay.
what do I mean by commercial activities? Is essentially in relation to generating revenue. So
Okay.
representative office or ROs, as we call it, they can't generate revenue directly in Indonesia.
Okay.
However, it is extremely useful for promotion, liaisoning with Indonesian parties, as well
Okay.
as sourcing. So with us here in Bagus Enrico and our subsidiary Tirta Mas Mandiri Indonesia, what we tend to do is provide that a representative office is quite a good starting point because essentially a representative office is an extension of the headquarters of a company. So for
Okay.
example, if we're talking about India and there is a specific area of business of, let's say, trade. Essentially, they would like to deal with the exchange of trade from India and essentially break into the Indonesian market. Now,
Right.
instead of having to either do a joint venture or any of the other specific aspects of entities in Indonesia, which I will get into later, by
Right.
doing an RO, a representative office, it essentially allows them to take a little sneak peek or
Okay.
look into what is the market outlook of the country specifically on the ground.
Okay.
Not necessarily from a research online, but essentially it allows the extension of the headquarters to talk to Indonesian parties to find out exactly what is going on. And that essentially is a aspect that allows them that would not require a lot of capital to establish.
Okay.
So one of our clientels, for example, would be an airline. Now, that airline would like to break into the Indonesian market, but the best way to do it, to reduce the amount of cost or capital required, as they are quite bootstrap, as you call it, or a bit low on revenue or cash,
Okay.
they would establish a representative office to essentially be an extension of the headquarters of
Okay.
that airline in the country. So that allows them, like I said again, to do promotion, licensing, as well as essentially ensuring that there's a presence in the country of Indonesia.
Okay.
Okay. Now, so that's our RO, everyone. Now, what we'll move into is into even more detail about of more of what I would consider a permanent establishment in the country.
Okay.
We've gone through JV, we've gone through an RO. Now we're going to go to something called a foreign-owned limited liability company, everyone. In
Phone
Indonesia, it
home.
would be called a
Okay.
PTPMA.
Okay.
So in short, it's called a PTPMA.
Okay.
Now, what is a foreign-owned limited liability company? Essentially, it is a limited liability company in Indonesia
Right.
owned by a foreign party. So
Right.
now, what is a PMA? It is a fully operational business vehicle under the Indonesian investment law. which allows for foreign companies to conduct business activities and generate income.
Okay.
So this is essentially what we would consider the most robust option, but also the most regulated. So if we compare the PTPMA compared to an RO, like I said, the RO is essentially an extension of the headquarters. They
Okay.
can do essentially scavenging aspects for the headquarters. But
Okay.
if we're talking about the PTPMA, they are essentially a fully owned entity in Indonesia that is allowed to generate income. Now, the most of the companies that do decide to establish a PTPMA in the country
Right.
would be industries that have quite a lot of cash flow.
Right.
So by having a PMA, essentially it allows full ownership
Okay.
of the company from overseas.
Right.
Okay, so
Right.
that essentially, but then that comes back to the point as I discussed about the negative aspects of specific areas of business, because specific area of business and objectives, there is something called a so-called percentage amount that is allowed to be held by foreigner. So it depending on the specific business, even if the company is a PTPMA, there still needs to be some aspect of an Indonesian party because a
Okay.
PTPMA cannot hold fully of a specific amount of percentage.
Okay.
I'll get into that more later. Or Swarn, if you would like to ask me questions, please do. Now,
Yeah.
so we've gone through a JV, we've gone through an RO, and
Right.
we've gone through a PTPMA, and now we're going to be going into something what it could be considered essentially of a franchise or licensing agreement,
Franchise
which
license.
is quite common in the food and beverage and retail sectors. So what it does is that it does enable foreign brands to enter the market
Right.
using local operators while maintaining brand control.
Right.
So it is essentially allowing foreign companies from India, for example, wanting to appoint a specific local company, Indonesia, to essentially white label the product to be utilized in the Indonesian market.
Okay.
Hence why the word is called a franchise or licensing agreement. It's not necessarily a entity or an establishment, but it is a strategy of which can be utilized to penetrate the Indonesian market. But yet again, Swarn and everyone listening, it really does depend on the specific business objective as well as the area of industry that the Indian company or any foreign company or foreign person is looking to establish and run in the country. So
Right.
depending on that, our firm as well as our subsidiary, the Mas Indonesia, we do that as a bread and butter every single day. So we know exactly how to navigate aspects to ensure that the most legal and the most market strategy aspect is as efficient as possible,
Okay.
which leads to the point of customization. So our firm doesn't necessarily only provide the legal compliance of establishing a market entry strategy, but
Okay.
a key point for us is to ensure the business longevity of the company in Indonesia. It's one thing to establish a company in Indonesia, whether it be in any of the market entry strategies I have just said, but to make sure that that specific structure is going to continue with a safe and sound aspect for the foreign business, for example, India,
Right.
is ensured.
So that
They,
that's
okay,
great.
sorry.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. And this is great. I think people who are listening or who would be listening later on, they would come to know how they can enter the Indonesian market. Joint ventures, as you said, and then representative office we have discussed. Then PTPMA. This is foreign owned companies, fully owned, right? So limited liability
Correct.
companies.
Correct.
Foreign owned. And then finally, franchise
Correct.
agreement. That is also one of the options that is available with the foreign
A
investors from
strategy.
any country, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So thank you for this information. And now, from a compliance perspective, I would like to know, Mr. Jonathan, what are the key legal
Sure.
and regulatory requirements foreign businesses must meet when entering the Indonesian market?
Ah, yes. So that's probably a lot of the emails and inquiries that Bagus Enrico and our subsidiary at Mas Indonesia get quite asked quite a lot in the sense of what exactly do we need to know? What do we need to comply with? What are the obligations of which we must fulfill in order to establish, for example, a PTPMA?
Yes.
So the first and most aspect that we need to understand, I think the best thing we can talk about that would be most applicable to most foreign businesses would be a PTPMA.
Okay.
Okay. So now a PTPMA, the minimum capital paid up is roughly around uh, 10, 10 billion rupiah, which would be equivalent to roughly around 620-ish thousand dollars. Now that
Okay.
may seem like a lot, but hence why I did mention that specific aspect of a representative office.
Okay.
So if a PTA gets to a point where it is too much of a dedication for a company from India or anywhere in the world to essentially invest in, there is always that possibility of going through different strategies, whether that would be a representative office, a
Okay.
joint venture, or even potentially a franchise or licensing agreement, for example. So apart from the authorized capital, the capital of which needs to be utilized to establish the foreign owned limited liability company, that is the amount, which is roughly around $620,000. Now,
Okay.
apart from that, that would actually be excluding the value of the actual land and building itself. Now, what do I mean by the land and building is that once a PTA PMA is established in the country, they must have an address. And
Okay.
a lot of companies, what they tend to do, if they don't have a physical office, sometimes they do have virtual offices as well, which is not an issue.
Right.
But the main key point is about the minimum paid up capital of $620,000.
Yes.
Now, moving from that as well, there's a lot of other mandatory aspects that need to be fulfilled. For example, manpower regulations,
Okay.
including what would be considered a social security aspect,
Mhm.
as well as the enrollment for employees for that PTPMA.
Right.
Now, this next point I'm going to make does have relation to the first question you did ask, one, in terms of the market entry strategies in
Right.
relation to the percentage aspects I was talking about. Now, what we mean by percentage aspects is related to the actual establishment of a PTPMA in Indonesia, which
Okay.
essentially would be done through a something called a business licensing through a system that the government has called OSS. Now, OSS stands for Online Single Submission. And that
Okay.
online single submission essentially allows the PTPMA or any entity or establishment in the country to essentially apply for the specific requirements that would be need to be complied with in order for that establishment, for in this case a PTPMA,
Okay.
to continue and finally run the business itself.
Okay.
But depending on the business, depending on the area of industry, that would branch off into specific different compliance mechanisms that must be fulfilled with.
Okay.
So the percentage aspect, for example, if you're in the area of work in, let's say, mining, for example, now that would depend on the extent of the type of mining. What would be the actual material of the mining? Would it be
Okay.
coal? Would it be limestone? Would it be gold? Now, those aspects are subject to a percentage amount, meaning there
Okay.
is only a certain amount of percentage that can be held by a PTPMA. For example, the government could say 49% is how much you can hold for PPA. So amount is 5% as well as the industry of which the foreign business is looking to penetrate into. So
Right.
it is really customizable in the sense that for us, when we do have clientele coming to Bagus Enrico Partners or Tirta Mas Mandiri Indonesia, the first question we ask to them is, what is the purpose of your penetration in Indonesia? Is it
Right.
more so finding more information? Is it more with the fact that you have done your homework, meaning the foreign business, and they can confidently say that the paid up capital, the authorized capital of $620,000 is something that they have already taken into great consideration, and they are confident into establishing a foreign-owned limited liability company.
Right.
But if
Okay.
they are not, then you can go back to the point of a representative office. So essentially, depending on what is required, customizability of which can be provided to the clientele, especially for foreign businesses. So essentially, like I said, so it comes down to the fact of the minimum investment. It
Okay.
comes down to the manpower regulations,
Manpower
business
regulation.
licensing through the online single submission. Now,
And
depending
holding
on
the
whether you're
physical
going to
land
have
also.
correct, and in relation to the land and building, so that excludes it includes that as well. Now,
Right.
if it comes to a point where there's foreign workers or there's tax aspects as well, those aspects need to be fulfilled as well.
Right.
So in Indonesia, it's called an NPWP, which essentially is a tax identification number. So
Right.
there's a lot of aspects that are very, very preliminary in the sense of, for example, what would be the business identification number, the tax identification number for the company, the actual ensuring that the notary in Indonesia. So essentially, what the notary would do is that there's a template of which that would be provided by the notary, and that
Yeah.
okay. So yeah, essentially, as I was saying, there's specific aspects that must be complied with, specific for a PTPMA. But depending on the area of business, depending on the industry as well, that would come with additional or quite what you would call standard aspects to receive specific for the establishment of a PTPMA. So sometimes there's a lot of reporting obligations as well of the regulated sectors, very heavily regulated sectors, which would
Okay.
include, for example, energy and natural resources, banking and finance,
Okay.
telecommunications and broadcasting, pharmaceuticals and health, as well as, for example, education and culture,
Okay.
especially if that has any involvement from a foreign business. So, just to recap, essentially, the key legal and regulatory compliances requirements, specifically on the PTPMA, as I've said, would relate to the actual authorized capital of which would need to be provided,
Yes.
the minimum investment value, essentially,
Right.
as well as the business area of business, as well as the industry, compliance with specific regulations, for example, manpower,
Right.
as well as the social security and getting the business licensing through, as I said, the
Online.
online single
Mhm.
submission.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
And depending on the actual area of business or industry, the
Right.
percentage of which does relate to how much a foreign company can own in that specific industry.
Okay.
Essentially, what we can also say is it's what's called a risk-based approach. So
Okay.
normally, if industry is what the government would consider a high risk approach, there would be more compliance. If it's a medium high, or if it's a medium or a low risk, then the specific compliance of licenses and aspects, those may differ depending on that so-called quote unquote risk-based approach system.
Great.
And so, for example, a high risk based approach, depending on the industry, would be aspects such as energy, banking, and finance, I've said before. So if there is no if there is a requirement for a specific industry, please, Swarn,
Yeah. Yeah.
please feel free to reach out, of course, and
See,
absolutely.
this is what I want to tell to my people also, the trade community, whosoever is listening. The purpose of such interactive meetings is that only if you have any need, trade need, compliance, regulatory, or anything that you want to know with regard to the Indonesian market, you can directly reach to our collaborative partners. Sole purpose of this meeting is to introduce our trade experts to you so that you can directly have access through the platform, virtual B2B platform of AECCI. You can book a meeting with them, or you can ask us for their address, for their contact directly. Trade community can reach to the collaborators, trade experts. So means this session will of course giving them a good guide, good knowledge about the Indonesian market, how they can enter there, and of course they would be requiring some services also. And to take that service, they can simply reach to you. And now
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, sir. So now IP protection is a concern for many foreign companies. So how effective is intellectual property right enforcement in Indonesia? So especially in sectors like pharmaceuticals and I would say consumer goods.
Mhm.
Yes.
Absolutely, sure. Thanks for the question, Swan.
Yeah.
So let's go straight into it. So intellectual property rights, the enforcement and the effectiveness of how effective is enforcing the intellectual property rights that
Yes.
have been afforded to a foreign-owned company operating in Indonesia. Essentially, I would not say that I'm an expert in intellectual property rights at all, but what I can do provide is specific
Yes.
aspects that our firm has experienced. So the way we feel for it is essentially the intellectual property right enforcement has improved in recent years. So essentially, that's to do with, well, the country's commitment under various ASEAN frameworks. So essentially, the enforcement remains an aspect. For example, like you mentioned, Swarn, absolutely, in relation to pharmaceuticals. So patent enforcement is increasing, but
Yes.
generic competition and regulatory delays can be problematic at times.
Okay.
Because of that, that would instigate a lot of, well, action lawsuits and whatnot, as well as notifications of asking whether or not this specific patent or copyright or trademark has been specifically registered with the World Trade Organization or with Indonesia, what is called a HACI. HACI is
Yes.
basically the equivalent of HAKI, which is essentially the intellectual property arm of the country
Yes.
is how I would say it. So apart from pharmaceuticals, we can talk very briefly on consumer goods. So with consumer goods, I think counterfeit goods does remain a major issue, not only in Indonesia, but around the world.
Yes.
Uh, it's fair to say that normally the amount of counterfeit aspects, excuse me, are normally occurring within Asia Pacific, not necessarily Southeast Asia, but Asia Pacific in general. So that normally is in cosmetics, apparel, and electronics.
Okay.
So essentially, to enforce an intellectual property right, the first thing that will normally be done is writing a specific letter or a clarification to the supposed party that is infringing on those intellectual property rights to ask for clarification.
Right.
As you said, that my background is a litigator. I do prefer ADR specs, meaning
Dispute
mediation or
resolution and
arbitration.
all.
Dispute resolution is something that I'm quite passionate about. So
Yeah, right.
instead of immediately filing lawsuits, immediately filing with, well, what I would like to say sometimes about emotional filing, the best thing is to send a letter first to ask for clarification.
Okay.
Now, some of the challenges specific in the enforcement and the effectiveness of these enforcements, the litigation process is quite lengthy. So there is a specific structure and order of which must be followed in terms of in any jurisdiction in any
Yes.
part of the world, whether it's common law or civil law, there is a process of which must be taken
Follow. Yes.
within due process.
Yes. Yes.
And sometimes there are aspects of inconsistent court decisions. So, for
Right.
example, in Indonesia, because it is not a common law jurisdiction,
Right.
case law does not hold weight. The civil law jurisdictions is based on case by case merits.
Okay.
So, whilst one aspect will be provided and provide judgment for by a specific area in Indonesia, may not necessarily come to light and repeat oneself in another specific case.
Right.
Whilst the merits may be roughly the same, the actual decision itself from the respective court may differ.
Right.
So that's an aspect that I think it must be aware of as well. And low damages awarded, to be quite fair, because it is a bit difficult to justify the amount of, well, I would say whether it's material or non-material damages, but to ob- obtain a specific amount of quantifiable slash monetary damages
Right.
due to the infringement of the intellectual property right, that may differ yet again because it has inconsistent court decisions and it is based on a merit per merit on the case itself.
Right.
And sometimes there are, I wouldn't say that there's weak border enforcement, but sometimes customs, the customs and excise area of Indonesia, for like, as a governmental point of institution, they do, of course, try to track down these aspects to ensure that the intellectual property right that has been afforded to the foreign business or
Okay.
to the appropriate party is maintained.
Yes.
So the direct, like I said, Haki essentially is another word, is the Directorate General of the Intellectual Property has become more proactive in working with businesses and associations to ensure that these intellectual property rights are enforced and
Okay.
and of course effective as
Okay.
well.
And
Yeah,
I think people who are interested to know more about the intellectual property rights, they can visit this Director General of IPR website also, right? So,
absolutely. So when you do visit that website, whilst it may seem from the offset a bit difficult to maneuver, that is why we do stand. So we can of course help our clientele, our foreign businesses that are in the country to essentially navigate the complexities of having to use the website as well as dealing with officials from the DGIP. Yeah,
okay, okay. And of course, your firm can extend all the required help to the people.
absolutely.
Okay, okay,
Yes,
great, great. So let us, this was really good to know all about IPR, and I'm sure people who are interested to know to take the service, they'll be moving to you. And let us now talk about the strategy again. I would like to know what are the pros and cons of partnering with a local firm, means versus setting up an independent entity there, independent office there. So what is the, which is better out of these two?
sure. I think that is a very, very good question as well, because that aspect essentially might lead a foreign business into one of two ways. Either you partner with a partner with a local firm or local company, or essentially you setting up independently. So if you were to go with a local partner, which is essentially a joint venture, as we've spoken before, or essentially a franchise, well, the way we see it is that in the positive light, you'd have access to the local markets and licenses.
Right.
So, for example, if there are specific licenses that would want to be obtained, instead of going through a PTP&A, which would have to start from scratch, from nothing, if you did do a joint venture, there's specific aspects of which would require specific licenses and compliance.
Okay.
Now, if the local partner already has that done, when you do go into a joint venture, you don't have to worry about those aspects.
Right.
And in order to maintain that uniformity, in order to maintain protectiveness in a joint venture agreement, of course, there would be another agreement between the foreign business as well as the Indonesian company of how they will maneuver. How we like to call it, how I like to call it is essentially a game plan or a playbook between the joint venture partners.
Okay.
And then another aspect would be is about the easier navigation of bureaucracy, as well as I said before, leveraging local networks in Indonesia. And this moves on to my point about, well, I wouldn't necessarily call it a con or a negative aspect of going to a local partner, but it is something that must be taken into great consideration. Would be about the specific goals of which the foreign business has and the local business has. If
Right.
they are one in unison and they have the specific business objective, that shouldn't be a problem. And then that goes back to my point of having essentially a joint venture agreement to ensure that the specific corporate aspects, corporate actions, and business objectives are clear and written in stone. Gentlemen agreements are one thing. However, when business means business and things don't go as planned, there must be a specific agreement or agreement that
Right.
will essentially dictate how to maneuver should it get to a point where the foreign business and the local partner can no longer continue their business as usual, which is
Okay.
why a joint venture agreement, for example, is extremely important from the offset.
Okay.
So, apart from the potential misalignment in goals, is that if you will, but it also does come to a point of shared control as well as the potential of possibly any risk of disputes. For example, if the foreign business as well as the Indonesian company gets to a point where they get to a deadlock, and the joint venture agreement provides what would be the next step after a deadlock. There would be mediation, there would be arbitration, or they would go to a point who holds more shares or who holds more percentage. Now, when it gets to that point, then naturally,
Yes.
hopefully not, disputes may follow. But normally, because you have a joint venture agreement, as the first so-called master agreement in relation to the joint venture agreement, the joint venture aspect, that would be the key document. But then yet again, there could easily be any subsidiary agreements to talk specifically about the joint venture agreement. So that's essentially something we feel that most foreign businesses should take into consideration. So that wraps my specific discussion about a local partner, a JV or franchise. Now,
Precisely, we can
moving
say if the agreement is drafted carefully, then this is the better option going for the joint venture, right?
absolutely, because to make sure that things are written in stone
Yes.
and things are written carefully and confirmed and signed by both parties, at
Right.
least there is a clear idea moving forward.
Yes.
Because if there's a misalignment of goals, if there's a misalignment of what to do if things don't go as planned,
Right.
that is normally when disputes or disagreements tend to be born from
Right.
Swan.
Right. Thank you so
And
much.
then so
Yeah.
no worries. And then moving on to the next and last point specifically is about, as you've asked, Warren, about an independent entity.
Yes.
As I've said, so an independent entity in this perspective would essentially be a PTPMA, which is
Right.
a foreign-owned limited liability company. So, well, the pros of that would differ from, of course, going to a joint venture in the sense that
Right.
if you have a PTPMA, you would essentially have full control over operations.
Right.
So because it is fully owned by a foreign business, they have full control, most of the shares, and they get to decide what goes and what doesn't go. So
Yes.
there wouldn't necessarily need to be a joint venture agreement because it is fully owned by the foreign-owned limited liability company.
Yes.
That would also allow, for example, stronger brand presence,
Yes.
and quite importantly as well is the long-term strategic positioning. So if we compare a PTPMA to what I've said before about a joint venture, the joint venture is called a joint venture for a reason. It's joint. A PTPMA stands on its own. And a represent office is, if you remember Swarn, a representative office is essentially an aspect for a company from overseas to have a little peek or a little sneak peek into the country of Indonesia. So if you go back again, sorry, to the PTPMA, there
Yes.
are aspects that foreign businesses do need to be aware of. For example, there are higher capital requirements.
Yes.
So in a joint venture that's shared with the partner, in a representative office, there is next to zero
Right.
capital requirements to establish a representative office. But for a PTPMA, if I said before,
That
is
was
roughly 10 billion Indonesian rupiah, which is an
right.
equivalent to around 620,000 United States
Right.
dollars. So apart from the requirements, there's also aspects of the compliance obligations, as I've said before. They're discussing about the PTPMA,
Right.
depending on the area of business, and of course, and again, depending on the industry of which the PTPMA is going in. And of course, there's aspects that we take into account is to do with the bureaucratical aspects of actually
Yes.
setting up the company, because we never
That
know
is very
sometimes
important. Yes.
when dealing with the government, well, they say, for example, it will take X amount of time for X document to come out, and there are unforeseen circumstances that the government may come across that would unfortunately affect the establishment of a foreign-owned limited liability company.
Right.
So, like the way we see it as well, conducting due diligences thoroughly. If you do opt for a legal partner, which is basically a joint venture,
Yes.
it is essentially that's something that well, Bagus Enrico and the Mas Indonesia does provide for our clientele is to please be sure about who are you going to business with,
Right.
because we never know what happens behind the scenes. So a little due diligence, basically doing your homework about who your local partner is. There's no harm in doing that because essentially it's a big investment for a foreign business.
Yes.
So that could easily include checking their corporate records, their financials, and whether there's any pending litigation dealings, whether it's from manpower, from the company. You never know. So
Right.
it's always good to know who you're going to business with, specifically for a joint venture
Right.
aspect.
Precisely, whatever way you opt for, you will have to give a proper study, a thorough background check, and of
Absolutely.
course, and means for any country, the bureaucracy that is also something that needs to be understood. So everybody will
Yes.
have to give the due diligence very carefully. You will have to study the market, and of course, taking the help of some expert sitting there. That is very important. I would again insist that our collaborator is sitting there. Mr. Jonathan is there for you. So whosoever is planning to go to Indonesia, they should directly reach to them through virtual B2B form. You can book your meeting, or directly you can ask us for their numbers or for their contact details. You can reach to them. And now, because we are running short with the time, so
Yes,
but then
yes.
too, this is very important questions. I would like to take this. I would like to know about the government incentives or the support that Indonesian government would be giving to the foreign entrants.
Sure. What I can provide for is for this specific point, I'll go to a very, very surface level, to be honest, because we're talking about doing business in Indonesia. The
Yes.
government does provide some incentives or initiatives. For example, there are some tax holidays or basically tax incentives for investments
Okay.
above a certain amount of investment in
Okay.
specific industries that are pioneering, be it pharmaceuticals, be it education. So depending on the area of industry again, and depending on the industry, it
Yes.
really does come to a point where that needs to be taken into account because the foreign business should also check with their appointed counsel or the appointed law firm that will be working with them to ensure whether or not there are some certain incentives that may push the foreign business to want to go into that specific area of business or industry. I keep repeating the word area of business and industry because those two aspects are extremely important because depending on what type, that would come along with different compliances and will come along with different incentives.
Yes.
Uh, so move, so moving along essentially. So apart from tax holidays, there are tax allowances for certain sectors. So for example, labor intensive, export oriented,
Right.
those are some aspects.
Okay.
And for example, special economic zones. So
Yes.
those aspects as well within industrial estates. There
Right.
will be simplified procedures and fiscal and or non-fiscal incentives depending on the specific area in
Right.
Indonesia.
Right.
We could also look at green energy, downstream mining,
Right.
digital economy, essentially. Those are currently high priority sectors. The
Okay.
fact that the Indonesia is trying to move their capital to Kalimantan. So I
Okay.
think the most government incentives right now, at least as far as I'm aware of, there's a lot of governmental incentives and well, whether that's fiscal or non-fiscal, in Kalimantan actually, in the new capital that's trying to be built. There's a
Okay.
lot of tax holidays, a lot of tax allowances as well.
Okay.
And there's a lot as well related to the access to governmental coordination facilitation from the Ministry of Investment,
Okay.
especially for strategic or national scale investment. So it really does differ
Okay.
again on the area of business as well as the specific industry. But if it gets to a point where you would like to inquire or
Okay.
anyone would like to inquire specifically on their area of expertise or the area of business, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to
Okay.
ask and go into more detail on your behalf.
Right, right. Thank you so much. And of course, we keep insisting our people to reach to you, and we keep creating the mode of means interaction between both the parties, the experts and the people who need services. This is what we are doing from a very long time. So this was a great
Thank you.
session, very insightful, very informative, and I'm sure this will be this will enable the people to explore more about the country. And thank you so much, Mr. Jonathan, for the deep insights. And this has been truly an insightful session on behalf of everyone from my trade community, from the ECCI management. I thank you for sharing the expertise. And for the people who want to get in connect with you, I would say yes, you can contact us again and again. I'm saying this, you can contact us anytime so that we can make you reach to the to Mr. Jonathan, and who would be helping you to reach to Indonesian market or to access to Indonesian market. So as we wrap up today's session, once again, Mr. Jonathan, we appreciate your time and expertise, and I encourage everyone to connect with you for further insights. And wishing you all the best, and we hope to collaborate very soon in coming future. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so thank you so much for those kind words, Swan. If it's okay, if you don't mind, if I could say a couple words as well.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Uh, I would like to say thank you very much to Swan specifically. We have been in contact for quite a while now.
Yeah, thank you.
And I do also encourage the Indian community, the Indian businesses to please do reach out to us at Bagus Enrico and Partners, as well as our subsidiary, Tirta Masumendri Indonesia. Our firm essentially has 12 practice areas, and we're heavily involved, actually, Swan. I'm not sure if you're aware of, with the Indian Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia.
Okay,
I'm sure you're aware of as well. We did hold a webinar a couple of weeks back with
okay,
an Indian law firm called Hamarubi Solomon and Partners.
okay,
And
great.
we also had the ambassador of India to Indonesia come
Okay.
on to our talk show as a guest speaker.
Oh,
So
that's
I do really highly encourage any Indian company to
yes,
come and just have a chat with us. It doesn't necessarily have to be something very formal.
yes.
Just to ask us, hey Jonathan, or hey Bagus Enrico, what is it specifically I would need to do if I wanted to go into this? By all means, reach out to us. And I think that's it from me. Just would like to thank you personally, Swan, as well as the entire AECCI team for having me on today. And I am looking forward to maintaining a very, very long and fruitful relationship between our institutions.
Thank you so much. It's completely our pleasure. And thank you again for sparing the time. And very nice to connect with you. Thank you, sir.
As always, thank you so much.
Bye bye.